Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar, Do's and Don'ts for Discussing Dementia. My name is Juliana Valencia and I am a social services specialist with Fairfax Area Agency on Aging. You should have received an email this morning with the speaker's slide. This is for you for future reference. If you have any questions during today's presentation, just know that we are allocating a few minutes so that you can submit your questions using the question box on your panel. In addition, we will be recording this webinar. So just everyone who's registered will get a recording to that webinar. And as soon as you signed out, there will be a brief survey. So if you could just take a few minutes and give us your feedback, I would really appreciate that. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Lindsay Vajpayee, who is the Director of Education and Outreach at Insight Memory Care Center in Fairfax. Lindsay has dedicated her career to working with older adults who live with dementia and their caregivers. Her certifications include Certified Dementia Practitioner, Certified Alzheimer's Disease and Dementia Care Trainer, Activity Director certification with a specialization in memory care, Master Training with the Best Friends Approach to Dementia Care, and she's a Dementia Friends Champion. Lindsay is passionate about quality dementia care from professionals, support and education for care partners, and assisting those with dementia to retain a sense of self and purpose throughout every stage of the disease. Lindsay is going to share her expertise with us today. Thank you, Lindsay, and welcome.
Thank you so much, Juliana. I'm so glad to be here today and to be invited as one of the speakers as part of this yearly series of seminars for caregivers. So if you'll just give me one moment, I will start sharing my slides. Okay, here we go. I trust you can all see this now. So I am really lucky to be here representing Insight Memory Care Center. And if you are unfamiliar with Insight, this is a nonprofit organization based in Fairfax. And the mission is to provide specialized care, support, and education for those living with memory impairments, their caregivers, their families, and the community. And in addition to being very passionate about these issues at a professional level, this is something that has impacted my family as well. So I'm kind of bringing some of that personal experience to my education as today too. So today we're discussing the do's and don'ts for discussing dementia. I know this is a very sensitive topic for a lot of families. You know, how do we talk about this with the person with the diagnosis, with friends and family members, with doctors and other kinds of providers? It can be a very stressful and overwhelming time. And so I'm hoping to share some information with you today that can help ease some of those conversations, to provide some sensitivity and some insight that can help you have really productive, successful, and confident conversations with family members and friends. But I want to start with just a few pieces of information to make sure we're all on the same page today. So first, let's just talk about some of the early signs of a cognitive impairment. So possible Alzheimer's disease or some other type of cognitive change. So some of the things that are not a normal part of aging that would be cause for concern would be some significant memory loss. And especially that would be short-term memory loss. Difficulty remembering things that have been recently told to me this morning, yesterday, last week, last month. And especially things that are really important and wouldn't normally be forgotten. So what you might see in a family member or a friend is someone who's asking you the same question kind of over and over again, or telling you the same story multiple times within the same conversation. Another warning sign would be some confusion with time or place, really like losing track of the passage of time, getting dates or seasons or years significantly mixed up, or being really disoriented when in newer locations or unfamiliar locations. Another early sign would be some difficulty with familiar tasks. So things like using your cell phone or the remote control, making coffee in the morning, using the microwave, paying bills, driving to familiar places, things that most of us can do without putting a whole lot of extra thought or effort into because it's just part of our routine. For someone experiencing a cognitive impairment, these sorts of daily things may become more stressful, more difficult. Another early sign might be some poor judgment or poor reasoning skills. We all might make a bad decision once in a while, but this is when it really starts to become a pattern. It's noticeable, it's concerning, it's something that's a significant change from that person's typical judgment and reasoning abilities. Another warning sign, communication changes, difficulty with word finding, making yourself understood, maybe your loved one understanding you. Maybe they're only catching part of the conversation or part of the set of instructions that you've just shared. You know, some of these abilities to communicate back and forth may be changing. Another early sign would be some difficulty with things that involve planning. So for example, if I'm planning my, what I need to get at the grocery store to make certain items, for our family this week, sequencing would be like following a recipe, being able to move from one step to the other in the appropriate order. And then problem solving, being able to reasonably deal with a problem that might arise. So if the stove starts on fire while I'm in the middle of cooking, am I reasonably able to handle that sort of problem? And then another early sign might be some changes in mood or personality. The person becoming a bit more confused, more irritable, more anxious, fearful, someone who might be withdrawing from social activities, someone who may no longer be initiating things that they once seemed to enjoy. These could be some early signs of cognitive changes. And they may or may not mean that there is an irreversible type of dementia. There are lots of things that can cause cognitive changes as we age that are really treatable or reversible. So thinking about things like a medication side effect or an interaction between medications, vitamin deficiencies, thyroid conditions, depression, brain tumor. There are a lot of things that can cause some of these cognitive symptoms. And when we're saying that someone has dementia, when we're using this word, we're really saying that there are cognitive changes happening that are not normal for this person's age, and they're interfering with everyday activities. They're interfering with everyday life. So dementia is not one specific disease, rather it's just kind of a general term for a set of symptoms. And this might include changes in memory, in executive thinking skills, in language and communication, in visual spatial abilities, and other things. When we talk about dementia, most people are familiar with the term Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's is the most common form of dementia. So if someone has Alzheimer's, that is dementia. If they have a diagnosis of dementia, it may or may not be the Alzheimer's type of dementia. There are many different forms of dementia. Each one has sort of a different disease progression, pathology, may have different primary symptoms, and so they may all look a little bit different. But Alzheimer's is about 60 to 80% of people who live with dementia. And when we think about those with Alzheimer's and other dementias, this is affecting over 6 million Americans. We tend to think about this as something that primarily affects older adults. And for most forms of dementia, including Alzheimer's, your risk does increase as you age. So it affects people usually in their older years of life. However, dementia can affect people at younger years as well, in your 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. It depends on the type of dementia, it depends on the person, but it is something that we have to consider. And 1 in 3 seniors dies with dementia. So not everyone will, not all of us will, but for probably a third of the population, we will have at least one parent who experiences dementia by the end of their lifetime. So our talk today really will be, for those of you who are caring for a loved one who has symptoms of dementia, maybe has a new diagnosis of dementia, or maybe the diagnosis isn't exactly brand new, maybe it was made a few years ago, but things are changing and you're starting to enter a space where this really needs to be addressed. Maybe for a while, we could just kind of put it on the back burner. We could try to forget that it was happening. We could try to make do, but you may be reaching a time where symptoms are changing, needs are increasing, and this really has to be faced head on. So there are benefits. There are definite benefits to detecting these changes early on and getting that diagnosis early on in the disease progression. One of the reasons that this is important is that it gives us a chance to involve the person with dementia in decision making for the future. So while that person has the most ability that they will have moving forward to participate in these discussions, we want to be able to have these discussions while that person is still capable, while they can make their wishes known, their needs known, can discuss future living options, can really do some of the things that are important for them to do, have conversations that are important to have early on in the disease progression. Having that early detection and diagnosis allows for appropriate medical management. There are medications that are FDA approved to help with Alzheimer's symptoms, for example. Or maybe there are different kinds of choices that can be made to help protect brain and heart health. Or maybe there are other sorts of medical needs that are kind of comorbidities, other things that are occurring. And we need to think about how we're going to manage sort of the medical needs holistically, the entire person, how their brain and their body is changing as they age. That early detection and diagnosis allows for some long-term care planning. What am I going to do? What kind of care might I need? Who's going to provide that care? Where will that happen? Do I have the financial ability to pay for the care that's needed? Do I need to be planning on tapping into other kinds of programs and resources to ensure that I receive the care that I need later on? And it gives family a chance to talk about these things openly together. Early detection and diagnosis really gives that opportunity to be involved in clinical trials and research. Most clinical trials are looking at people who have that early stage diagnosis, or even kind of further upstream in a space we might call mild cognitive impairment, which is kind of like that area between normal aging and dementia. Mild cognitive impairments, that kind of time in the middle. So this is the time when people really can get involved with clinical trials, and at a time where it may feel like that person is really, something's happening that's beyond their control, and they don't like it and they don't want it, and you want to know, like, well, what can I do? What can I do about this? Being involved in research is a great thing that you can do. And also that early detection and diagnosis allows for access to resources and development of a care team. There's that saying, you don't know what you don't know. Most people are not going out and looking for dementia and caregiving related resources and programs and people to help them until they're in a position where they actually need this kind of help. There are a lot of programs available for those with a recent diagnosis of dementia, in that early stage, and also for caregivers, care partners who are just starting to shift into this caregiving role. And so you don't want to miss out on opportunities to utilize resources and services that might be really, really helpful for your family. So when we're thinking about these kinds of very sensitive conversations, yes, it would be easier to just put our heads in the sand, right? To just kind of put it on the back burner, to not talk about uncomfortable topics, sensitive topics. You may be worried about how they're going to go. But we really do need to start this conversation somewhere. We can't put our heads in the sand forever. And in fact, when we avoid these conversations, we avoid discussing important things, talking as a family, planning for the future, that increases the risk that really kind of terrible things might happen, and we are totally blindsided by it. We're totally unprepared. So by planning in advance, starting these conversations early, we can actually try to circumvent some of the challenges that might occur in the future. We are prepared. So starting the conversation means you start with educating yourself and your family about the disease. So I mentioned a couple minutes ago, there are many different forms of dementia. What's happening in the brain varies from one type to another. The symptoms may look a bit different. The speed of progression may be different. Comorbidities play a role. So it is important to start really thinking about, sorry, my screen's decided to act up. Here we go. To start thinking about, well, what form of dementia does my loved one have? And what do I need to understand about the specifics of this disease? So what do these symptoms look like now? There may be things happening at home and you're kind of questioning, like, are they doing this on purpose? But I just told them that a few minutes ago, why aren't they remembering? Some days might be better than others, and it just kind of makes you wonder. But when you have a better understanding about what's happening in the brain, what those symptoms look like right now, what kinds of symptoms to be anticipating in the future, it does give you some knowledge, and knowledge is power. When we understand what's happening, we really can better support the person living with dementia. We can be better prepared and more patient as caregivers as well. So start attending classes about dementia, and especially if your loved one has a more rare type of dementia, like Lewy body dementia, FTD, or something else. Really starting to learn about that disease. And you'd probably be surprised at some of the information out there, and really just things you hadn't thought of. For example, did you know if someone has Lewy body dementia, there are certain medications, even over-the-counter medications, that individual really should not have, because they can have this paradoxical reaction, right? But would you know that? Does the common person know that? Probably not. So really starting to understand the disease and to help your family understand it as well. Thinking about spouses, adult children, siblings, grandchildren, even other family members and friends. Another part of starting the conversation is deciding when and how to disclose the diagnosis to others. So we're going to talk more about this in a little while, but first we want to talk about starting the conversation with the person who's living with this diagnosis. We do want to respect that the person with the disease has a right to know what is happening to them. Now, thinking has sort of changed on this over the last couple of decades, just like how maybe a few decades ago, if someone received or was diagnosed with cancer, maybe the doctor or their family would choose not to tell them about the diagnosis. But now that's changed, right? There's sort of an understanding in the medical community and really even in families that we do share these important health changes. And the same can be said for something like having dementia, that we do want to give that person an opportunity to learn about their diagnosis. The person may have an awareness that something is changing. I hear people use phrases like, my brain is just mush today, or am I going crazy, or why am I so forgetful? There may be an awareness that something is going on and that person doesn't have answers to it. Sometimes not knowing is actually crueler than the effects of the disease, right? Am I not trying hard enough? What is this? Is this a memory loss thing? Is it Alzheimer's? Is it a mental illness? What's going on? So we do want to respect that the person has a right to know. Now, not everyone is going to be open to this information, is going to be interested in it, is going to agree with you. And I'm not saying that we're trying to get someone to accept their diagnosis. We're not trying to make someone understand their diagnosis, but I'm talking about just that opportunity to share this information and see how your loved one responds. Are they seeking more information? Do they want to be able to talk openly about this with you? And giving that opportunity. Do they have questions for the doctor that they want to be able to ask about symptoms, about treatment, about research, about daily life? We want them to have this opportunity, right? So it doesn't mean that someone will remember their diagnosis. It doesn't mean that we should sort of force it upon anyone, but we want to respect that the person has a right to know. And when a person knows their diagnosis and has at least some understanding about it, whether or not they agree with the terminology, there may be at least a general understanding of, I'm more forgetful than I used to be, as an example. So we do want to involve the person living with dementia in conversations that are about them, right? We're not just talking about someone when they are still capable of participating in that conversation. Now, we'll talk in a little while about ways that we might change our communication styles, how we can communicate more effectively, but just generally at this point, wanting to make sure that we are including people with the disease in our conversations. Now, we don't just walk straight into this conversation, right? We want to be prepared. So some of the things to consider when you are preparing for these sorts of conversations. We do want to have the conversation as early in the disease progression as possible. All right, we're not sort of waiting until there's a day when something big happens and we're kind of forced into a conversation with our loved ones. We want to be able to really start this conversation and be open and trusting of each other very early in the disease process. You know, even at the point of mild cognitive impairment, to be able to talk openly about that, to learn what that terminology means, and as someone's brain changes may progress into the space we would call dementia, you know, well, what does that mean? And being able to start talking while that person, again, has the most capacity, the most ability to communicate effectively, to think as reasonably as possible, which is earlier on in the disease process. We want to think about who should have the conversation. So typically, my guidance here would be that it would be a very small and intimate kind of conversation, maybe one-on-one, or maybe sort of a group of 3 people. So the person living with dementia and maybe their spouse is the place to start, or the spouse with the doctor, or maybe there are adult children. And if there are many adult children, rather than kind of bringing together a family meeting of everyone, which sort of looks like an intervention, a person may feel kind of ganged up on. So maybe it's just 1 or 2 adult children who sit down with mom or dad together. So, but really think about who is the best person, and who has that rapport, who will that person open up to, who do they look to, you know, for medical information, who goes to the doctor's appointments with them, right? These are probably the places to start. And sometimes this might not be family. Maybe it is the doctor who is the best person to have this conversation. And maybe you're, as a family member, you're kind of a silent bystander there in the appointment. Or maybe it's a very close friend or a former colleague or someone from your faith community, you know, that would be involved in these conversations, because that trust is there, the respect is there, and the person will be more open to these conversations. You want to think about the environment. Where do we talk? We want to think about a space that's very comfortable for the person living with dementia, a space that is quiet. There are not a lot of distractions. So if you're going to sit down and talk about these really important topics, let's turn off the TV. Let's turn off the radio. Let's not do this, you know, in a noisy restaurant, or when the grandkids are running around at somebody's birthday party. That's probably not the best thing. So think about a really comfortable environment for your loved one, and think about what is good timing. So timing in a couple of respects. Timing, like what's a good time of day for the person? You may recognize possibly that your loved one seems a little more like their mood is a little better in the morning. They're a little more able to kind of grasp and process information earlier in the day. Maybe that's a good time of day to have the conversation. Maybe, you know, talking about this over dinner at the end of the day when the person is just really tired. You know, I'm not my best self later on in the day either, right? It's been a long day. I've been thinking hard, working hard. I'm hungry. You know, that's maybe not the best time for a lot of people to have an important conversation. But aside from even kind of like what time of the day is best for your loved one, you know this person. You have been reading their signals, their body language, probably for years. And you kind of know when someone's mood is a little bit on edge, and maybe that is not the best time to have a conversation that would potentially be scary or upsetting for them. So think about like when to have this conversation, good timing, sort of looking at moods and things that you do together, and the ways that you talk and interact together, to try to identify sort of this good segue into the conversation. So you may want to plan very specific ways to start the conversation, not just kind of waiting to see what pops into your mind in the moment. I mean, yes, you have to be in the moment and you have to be sort of responsive to the person and be nimble in these conversations, but it would be helpful to think ahead about how you plan to start the conversation. And especially if you are coordinating with another person. So for example, maybe it's 2 adult children who are going to sit down with dad to talk together. Talk with that sibling first and come up with a game plan. How are we going to bring this up with dad? What role will each of us take in this conversation? So for some families, you may already have kind of a transparency and openness. Maybe your loved one has been making comments about being forgetful, and you might be able to sort of piggyback on that into a conversation. I know, Mom, you've been mentioning that you're frustrated, that you're feeling more forgetful lately, and I want us to be able to talk about that. Maybe that's your segue into the conversation. Maybe something has happened at a doctor's appointment or with another friend or family member or neighbor, and you want to be able to use that as an example to sort of start this conversation. Maybe something has happened, like a car accident, or a license needs to get renewed, or the taxes need to be done. There's some big thing that really needs to be addressed. So maybe that is kind of the impetus to start the conversation. So, it's something where you want to think about it in advance. And then one of the things you want to do as you're preparing for this conversation is to already have a plan in mind for help. So if the conversation, let's say it is about driving, this is one of the first big, hard topics that families have to face with their loved one living with dementia. So not just saying, hey, Dad, you really shouldn't be driving anymore. The doctor doesn't think you should drive. I don't think it's safe for you to drive, but having no plan in place. That's going to be really hard for Dad to take. Rather, when you're coming into this conversation, already have a plan in mind. Maybe you are talking about transitioning away from driving, but you already have some possible solutions on deck. I'm going to come and pick you up to go to church on Sundays. Your neighbor goes to the same pickleball games as you, and they've always mentioned they'd be happy to carpool, ride together, to drive you. Maybe you know about a volunteer service in the community that offers rides to appointments or to senior centers or other kinds of programs. Kind of gather that information in advance. Think about what the plan will be so that you're not just kind of going into this conversation saying, we'll figure it out, but it's, I've done some research. Here are some of the ways that we can help handle this. Here are some ways that we can help make sure that you are still as independent as possible, that you can still do all of the things that are important to you. Now, during the conversation, you want to be aware that the person may have some gaps in self-awareness. Even if the person does understand and accept their diagnosis, it's quite likely that they don't see that these changes are as significant as you see. They may not be quite as concerned as you are. So for example, they may understand that they have a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease, but the way that they sort of report on how they view the world may be very different from what you see. That person may say, I do fine living alone all day long. I take my pills, I pay my bills, I see my friends, I make phone calls, but maybe what you see is quite different. You see that person is really lacking that ability to structure their time. They're messing up on paying the bills, right? Things may be going on. So just kind of having an awareness of this from the get-go. There may be these gaps in self-awareness for the person living with dementia. And this is not about you needing to provide like additional proof so that they understand or they remember. This is really just part of the way that the brain is changing, and that person's ability to be self-aware is starting to change. And especially when we think about a memory loss component, that person may not remember some of the strange things that have happened. During the conversation, you're going to be tailoring the conversation based on the person, based on their personality, their communication style, the way that they use maybe humor in conversation, or the way that they prefer to have, very direct conversations. You're thinking about that person's cognitive abilities, what they're able to understand, their emotional space, how they are able to take in information. You may recognize in your conversation that this is enough for today. right? Enough is enough. You may notice that person starting to kind of shut down in the conversation. Okay, time out. This is maybe too much information for this person right now. So just kind of tailoring the conversation. Now within the conversation, you really want to be intentional about expressing your commitment to help and support the person. You know, really kind of reinforcing that idea that we are a team, right? This is not like a me against you or the world against you, you know, the doctor and all the kids and all of that. This is about like, we are in this together. I am going to be here for you. I'm going to support you. I want to help you, you know, and really making sure that person knows that you genuinely are in this with them. Providing love and reassurance can be really helpful in these sensitive conversations. You know, when people know that you're coming to this with best intentions, with that feeling of love, with that, you know, that kind of reassuring, I want to say positive sort of communication style. And I'm not saying this is all sunshine and rainbows, and, you know, we're not trying to diminish the seriousness of these conversations or diminish the feelings that that person has if they're feeling scared or overwhelmed, but to try to bring sort of a positive light to this, you know, to provide that reassurance, again, that we're in this together. Now, within the conversation, you may need to really practice patience and kindness. Your loved one may say things that frustrate you. They may feel very hurt or kind of attacked or sort of defensive. And it may be hard to maintain your patience and to maintain that very kind of kind, gentle, reassuring tone of voice. But really trying to keep this conversation going as smoothly as possible and as comfortably as possible for your loved one. You know, and that usually does require a whole lot of kindness and patience. But also recognizing the conversation may not go as planned. These are not generally easy conversations, right? And we have to be there in the moment, be flexible, kind of tailoring that conversation, but ultimately recognizing things may not go the way that I want them to go. They may not even go the way that I think they will go. And just being open to that. And it doesn't mean that you have failed in any way in this conversation. It's just that these are hard things. These are situations your family has probably not had to experience before. And so just like you are kind of navigating your way through these conversations, your loved one is too. And they're doing the best that they can. It's hard for everyone, but exceptionally hard for the person whose brain is changing. Now, within the conversation, we want to think about effective communication techniques. We want to be really aware of the tone of our voice. We may have all had an experience where, you know, two people could say the very same words to you, but depending on the tone of voice, it means something very, very different, right? So even if you're saying the right things, what is your tone of voice expressing? As a person with dementia's brain changes, I mentioned their communication abilities change. So as over time, that person is less and less able to communicate in a verbal way or understand all of the things that you're saying, they're more and more relying on things like your tone of voice and your body language to understand your message. So really paying attention to that tone of voice. When we talk about things like patience, it's really trying to keep ourselves sort of grounded, keep ourselves calm. That might mean sort of taking a deep breath, recalculating the situation, but keeping that tone of voice in check. Making sure that your nonverbal signals match your message. So again, you may be saying sort of the right thing, but do your nonverbal signals match what it is you want the person to understand? So if I'm being kind and patient and loving and I'm being empathetic, I could supplement what I'm saying maybe by sitting next to you, turning towards you, maybe putting my hand on your shoulder or on your thigh or your knee to let you know I'm there for you. Maybe we can hold hands or I can give you a hug, right? If I'm crossing my arms, if I'm furrowing my brow, if I've got kind of just a deadpan face going on, tapping my foot, pacing the room, it doesn't matter what I'm saying, my nonverbal signals are betraying me. They are giving an entirely different message, and that's the message your loved one is going to pick up on. So being mindful that your nonverbal signals match the message you're trying to get across. And you're also paying attention to your loved one's nonverbal signals. You know, it's what they're saying, but it's also thinking about, like, what is the feeling behind the words? Maybe the words are, you know, you're crazy. None of this is going on. None of this is happening to me. I don't need any help. Maybe those are the words. But what are the feelings behind that? Is my loved one feeling like their independence is being taken away? Are they feeling scared? Are they feeling a loss of control? Are they feeling disrespected? You know, what is going on there? And how can I really try to connect with that feeling, try to respond in a way that respects the feeling, rather than only focusing on the words that my loved one says. And I want to really understand the feeling behind the reaction, right? That this is not something that's personal to me. It may feel very personal. My loved one is getting really upset. And that doesn't feel good. You know, we've loved each other for years and years and years and respected each other, and it can be really hurtful to be in a conversation that could be so uncomfortable. But really trying to understand those feelings, those meanings behind what they're saying and behind the way that they're reacting, and validating those feelings. You know, really trying to put yourself in those shoes. What must it feel like for my loved one to have to confront a diagnosis, to have to be, you know, sort of told that it's not safe to drive anymore, or whatever other really difficult conversations you're trying to have. Validating those feelings, you know, and again, trying to come back with that sense of reassurance, empathy, connectedness. Because at the end of the day, you want to retain the relationship, right? You're in this together. That's what the conversation needs to end with. So some of the specific things that you may want to say, and you may have other ideas that you can jot down or that others might share in the questions box here in the control panel. Some of the things you might want to say, you know, I'm here for you. Really, whatever words those might be to reinforce that, like, we are going to face this together. I am in this with you. I am here for you. I am not going to leave you. You might say, especially if you're at that point of like not even yet diagnosed, but you see these kinds of early signs, let's find out what's going on. You know, there are a lot of things that can cause us to think differently with age. So let's go and see the doctor to find out, you know, what's causing this and what we can do about it. Let's find out. And let's make a plan. You know, not just like kind of ripping off a Band-Aid, like here's the new diagnosis or here's the big change that's going to occur in your life. But let's make a plan. You know, that's showing that we are going to talk about it together. We're going to make sure that what you value, what you prefer, what your needs are, what your wishes are, that we're going to respect those to the fullest extent possible. So really reinforcing that message of we're in this together, we're going to think through this, we're going to do what's best, not just for you, but what's important to you. Okay, but some of the things we don't want to say. And unfortunately, my list is very long for the don'ts. Some of the things you don't want to say. I just told you that. You're caring for someone who has a cognitive change and likely a memory impairment that is part of this. So expecting someone to remember something that we've just said to them or recently said to them is really unrealistic on our part. I mean, like, that's really our problem, that we have these expectations that are unrealistic. So we can just kind of take that out of our vocabulary. Also, don't you remember? There's really never a good time to say, don't you remember? So you might catch yourself saying, well, don't you remember? I told you that this morning. Don't you remember we're going to see Susie this afternoon? Don't you remember, you know, we sold the car? Saying, don't you remember, again, is asking someone to rely on their short-term memory, which is impacted by a disease in their brain. This is not that the person isn't trying hard enough or, you know, that it's within their control. So find other ways to talk with the person rather than saying, don't you remember? Don't use lengthy sentences or medical jargon. When you're having these kinds of sensitive conversations with your loved one, don't put in too many details, or multiple ideas or multiple questions back to back. It's too much information all at once. So you're really thinking about just being very clear, kind of breaking things down into manageable parts, simplifying what you say, using language that's going to be familiar to the person and accepted by the person. We don't want to kind of quiz or test our loved ones. Like, don't test your loved one about what they had for breakfast this morning. Don't quiz them about the names of all their kids or grandkids. It's not helping anything. It's making your loved one maybe feel frustrated, feel embarrassed, feel kind of upset with you, feel sort of condescended, or that they're less than. And it's not going to be effective in sort of exercising their brain to retain that information. So really try to fight that urge to quiz or test your loved one. We don't want to treat people with dementia like children or use elder speak. So we're not talking to somebody like they're a child. And elder speak is, like, as examples, it's saying things like honey or sweetie. No, these are adults. And yes, we change the way that we communicate in some ways that are similar to maybe the way that we might communicate with a younger person. But we're not using elder speak. We're not, honey, sweeting somebody. These are still adults who are worthy of respect and dignity. We don't want to talk about our loved ones like they're not there. You might be sitting together as a family. Don't talk with your sibling about mom and how mom is doing and what mom did today and all these things without including mom in the conversation. She is right there. In these difficult conversations, don't let your emotions spiral out of control. Again, this is all about that kind of practicing patience, really trying to ground yourself, communicating well. Try not to let those emotions get the best of you. You may sense that you're feeling frustrated or angry or resentful or guilty or uncomfortable. Try not to let those emotions really get the best of the conversation. And also in these conversations, you may be tempted to make promises. I promise I will always be the person who cares for you. I promise you will never leave this house. I promise. Really try not to make promises that you may not be able to keep. You can promise to be, to be there to support your loved one, to help your loved one, to be there for them. But it may be unrealistic to promise that I will be your only caregiver, or you will always, stay under this roof, because things may happen in the future that you were not anticipating. And then at that time, you may feel guilty, but I promised him, I promised her. So really, that reassurance is so helpful, but try not to make specific promises that you may not be able to keep. So this is a question I get a lot, multiple times a week. My loved one is in denial of his diagnosis. How do I get him to accept it? So I'm going to introduce a new term to you, anosognosia, which the Greek root of this term means without knowledge of disease. So for those experiencing dementia, sometimes like mental illnesses, traumatic brain injuries, strokes, there a number of conditions that person may experience this anosognosia, which really means the person sincerely believes that nothing is wrong with them. So this may be what your loved one is experiencing. When we say that someone is in denial, that's really like an emotional protective mechanism, right? There's information out there that is too scary or overwhelming, so I'm going to sort of turn away from it. That's denial. But with anosognosia, it's that the person's brain doesn't allow them to be self-aware in that way, to see and understand what is going on with them. The way that they view themselves is different than how the rest of the world views them, and they can't make those two things come together. So if you're having these kinds of conversations, again, the goal is not to make someone accept their diagnosis or make them face it or make them understand it. It may be that they really can't. So what do you do if this is the situation you find yourself in? Well, as a care partner, you kind of work around it, right? You make sure you're addressing different safety issues, different needs in the home, needs of your loved one, important conversations that you really want to have with them about their wishes and their values and preferences. But you're kind of working around the elephant in the room, right? The person is not recognizing, not able to recognize the type of dementia that they have. So you just kind of need to do what you need to do by working around that. So use words that are well received by the person and make sense to them. So maybe they do have a diagnosis of Alzheimer's, but the A word is something that they just really cannot tolerate. It just, when you say Alzheimer's, you notice them shut down or that they get really angry or defensive. Use whatever words work for them. So maybe you call it memory loss, maybe you call it forgetfulness, maybe you call it aging. It doesn't matter what you call it, as long as it allows you to have these important conversations with your loved one. You do want to pick your battles, right? It's more important to retain that relationship, to make sure the person is as safe as reasonably possible, without taking away all independence, all quality of life, all sort of respect for their wishes. It's kind of balancing these things out and deciding which things do I really need to face and deal with, and which things can I just let go. And then we want to avoid arguments or trying to reason with the person. Again, this is not about providing extra proof, doctor's notes, or symptom charts or anything like that. Avoid arguments about this. If the person says, I don't have dementia, there's nothing wrong with me, don't get into a debate about it. Again, you're just kind of like working around it. Okay, so in the last few minutes here, let's talk about how you tell family and friends and then how you talk with healthcare providers. So you do have to think about when and how to tell other people about this diagnosis. And you probably will provide a different level of information depending on the relationship that the person has to your loved one and the types of interactions that they have together. So usually the first person to be in the loop here would be like a spouse who hopefully is involved in these conversations with the doctor, learning about the diagnosis, having an opportunity to ask questions and get more information. Typically adult children are brought into the mix next. And probably for adult children, you do disclose the actual diagnosis and hopefully open the door to these kinds of just very trusting and transparent conversations. But then when you think about things like close friends, the way and the timing in which you tell them may be a bit different than those more acquaintance types of friends. Maybe you tell the next door neighbor before you bother telling other folks that the person may see less regularly. What about things like people in our faith community? What about our attorney? What about our financial advisor? What about our therapist or our accountant or whoever? You're really thinking about who needs information so that they can support you in the best way possible, that they can do whatever job you've worked with them to do if this is more of a professional that you work with. But you do want to share this information. Make sure that people have an opportunity to understand what's going on so that they can continue to be in your life, that they're not so kind of confused or overwhelmed or turned off or uncomfortable that they're disengaging. So think about who you're going to tell, how you're going to tell them. And you do want to be able to talk about this with your loved one who's living with the diagnosis and to take their preferences into account. But there are occasions where maybe the person says, I don't want you to tell anybody. Don't tell them. I don't want them to know. And oftentimes that comes from a fear of, I don't want them to treat me differently. But as a caregiver, you can't go on for months and months or years and years keeping all of this information to yourself. It's exhausting emotionally and physically. So there may be times when you really do need to tell someone without your loved one's kind of permission to have those conversations. When you're talking with family and friends, you want to be honest. And you be honest about the diagnosis, be honest about the symptoms, be honest about how that person can support you, maybe what you need from them or what you hope from them, that our relationship is so important to us. We love spending time together. We want to continue spending time with you. just really having these very open, trusting conversations. You may want to educate family members and friends about the disease and the symptoms. Maybe you invite them to participate in a class with you. Maybe you email them a great article that you just read or a website. Maybe you want to give them a few tips on how they can best communicate and interact with your loved one. This might be children and grandchildren who are coming to visit this summer for the first time in a year and a half. Prepare them, give them some information, give them some pointers so that they aren't unprepared, so that they don't come in and kind of make a situation even harder than it needs to be. So nurture these relationships, but also understand that they may change. And sometimes that's for the better and sometimes that's hard. So it may be that people who've been your best friends for decades just really turn away when these relationships change. But on the flip side, there may be people who've been, kind of friends or neighbors or acquaintances who really step up to the plate, who really get what you're going through, who are a tremendous source of support, and you never would have expected that. So keep nurturing these relationships because they will be important moving forward. So share those tips for communication and interaction with these neighbors, with these friends. A really good place to look for kind of just very general information on how to be a good neighbor, how to be a good faith community member, how to be a good friend would be these classes called Dementia Friends Information Sessions. So here in the Fairfax area, there's an initiative called Dementia Friendly Fairfax that got up and running a couple years ago. And Dementia Friendly Fairfax offer these 1-hour Dementia Friends information sessions. And that is really like the perfect amount of information for those friends and neighbors who just need a few tips and tricks and some basic understanding so that they can be supportive of friends and neighbors in the community who are living with cognitive changes. And also ask these family members and friends for help. They love you, they want to support you, they want to help you, but they need information, they need some direction, they need to know what it is that you need help with. And then lastly, how do you talk with the healthcare provider, like the doctors? Providers can be really helpful in sharing and explaining the diagnosis as well as treatment options. So you may have this kind of conversation disclosing the diagnosis to your loved one, with the support of that physician. It can take it from being this kind of personal thing to being a little bit more objective. You may want to give the provider some specific information in advance of doctor's appointments that you don't want to say in front of your loved one. Yes, you should go to the appointments with your loved one all the way into the exam room, but maybe you don't want to kind of share the nitty-gritty, say things that would either embarrass or upset your loved one. Get that information to the provider in advance. Maybe you call a day or two before the appointment and you talk with a nurse. Maybe you kind of write some things out and you send them through the electronic, like the e-chart, or that you can print it off and hand it over to the receptionist when you check in for the appointment. In some way, be able to share important information with the doctor, even if you don't want to say it right there in front of your loved one. You want to set an expectation with the doctor that the person with dementia will be involved in the conversations during the appointment and not sort of talked about. I had this experience with my children and a pediatrician, where one pediatrician was always talking to me, never talking directly to my children who were old enough to be able to talk back with him. So we switched doctors, right? And are much happier with a physician that includes them in the conversation. Same thing with your loved one. They should be included in that conversation, feel part of it, have an opportunity for their needs and their opinions to be known. And also let the provider know what you need from them. Do you need more information? Do you need resources? Do you need someone who can help you talk with your loved one about these things? What is it that you need from providers? So talk with the doctor, let them know what your expectation is of them. And I'll end with a well-known quote that you've probably heard before, maybe in a different context, but it applies here too. So this is from Maya Angelou, and the quote is, "Do the best you can until you know better. Then, when you know better, do better," right? You are navigating this new territory for your family, and you're doing the best you can with what you've got, and your loved one is too. And when you know more, you do better, right? You're constantly working on this together as a family. So I hope that the information that I've shared today can be helpful with you in this process. And for those who are unfamiliar with Insight and are looking for a local resource to provide education, to provide support, or even early stage programs and care for those living with dementia, please contact Insight Memory Care Center, or if you have questions after today's class, I invite you to get in touch with me and I'm happy to answer them. So.
Thank you, Lindsay, for that wonderful presentation. At this point, I want to invite our audience to submit your questions. We do have a few minutes, so someone has already emailed or sent a question through the question box on your panel, and it says, how do you get things like power of attorney in place if the person has an anosognosia? Is that how you say it?
Yeah. So how do you get the power of attorney in place, and like probably other legal documents too, when the person doesn't recognize that they have these kinds of changes? I would try to confront this conversation as like, these are documents that we should all have. All adults should have them. We know, who do you want to make decisions if something were to ever happen to you? You could get in a car accident. You could have a heart attack. You know, like things could happen that you're not anticipating. And so like these are important documents, and even if you're not talking about it from the framework of having a cognitive impairment, they're things that should be done. Your loved one may have documents in place that just need to be updated. And just for you as the caregiver, if you have listed your loved one with dementia as your power of attorney in the past, you're going to want to change those too. Sometimes it works if there's been a situation like maybe someone that you mutually know who's had a significant health change, being able to use that as an example, that, John just got in a car accident and now, his family is having to make these tough decisions. And I hope we never get into a position someday where I don't know what you want. So let's make sure that what you want is written down somewhere where we all understand and we all can access it.
Mm-hmm. And so our next question is, what do you do when a person is denying what's occurring? And I think you kind of touch on that. So how can you have that conversation when there's denial?
So I would kind of work around it, right? If that person doesn't agree that they have maybe memory loss, that they have a dementia diagnosis, don't even use those words if it's just going to shut that person down in conversation. But there are still needs, right? There's still things that have to be addressed. So try to find like what perspective, like what would motivate them? What would they agree to? What have they been saying, or what do they need? Or maybe that you're trying to, Dad, you've got so much on your plate right now. I know you haven't been sleeping well. Like, let me just do this for you. Like, let me help you with this for a month or two until you, kind of get back on your feet. It's just kind of like making sure everything that needs to happen still happens without saying the words out loud. And that might take some extra coordination. That may take some support from the doctor, from other siblings, from friends or neighbors, but still, still facing it, even if you can't quite talk about things as openly.
So there's another interesting question here. Does alcohol, including wine, trigger dementia? And then it said Surgeon General warns pregnant moms risks. Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, so I kind of have a two-part answer here. Long-term alcohol misuse can increase risk for dementia. There's actually a specific type of dementia called Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome that is related to a vitamin B1 deficiency, which is caused by long-term alcohol misuse. So yes, long-term alcohol use can cause dementia, but also even short-term alcohol use can cause dementia-like symptoms, right? I may not remember what somebody told me last night if I was drinking too much, right? Or I might not communicate well. I might have slurred speech. I might be off balance. I might not make sound decisions. So there can be, sort of these dementia-like symptoms. Maybe the person is actually utilizing alcohol and is hiding it really, really well, and you wonder what's going on. Or then there's the person who has dementia who enjoys maybe a glass of wine, but because of the memory loss, they're on their second glass or their third glass because they don't remember that they've already had one, right? So there are lots of different kind of ways that alcohol and dementia become a challenge together. And I think participating, like number one, either calling and consulting with someone, like calling the intake line for Fairfax County, calling Insight, calling the Alzheimer's Association, calling someone to really talk about your specific scenario is helpful. And also participating in support groups, because you're not the only person who's working on this, who's dealt with this, and learning from other caregivers can be extremely powerful and validating.
That is true. Well, Lindsay, thank you so much for those wonderful answers. Very insightful. And at this time, I want to thank everyone who has shared an hour of their time with us. Thank you for spending that time of your day with us. And so we are getting ready to end today's webinar. And as you signed out, there will be a brief survey. Please take a moment to answer those questions because it really helps us provide topics that you want to learn about. I also want to invite you to our next webinar, which will be on Wednesday, June 23rd. Our topic will be on technology and caregiving, latest devices and applications to help you at home with your caregiving journey. So Lindsay, thank you so much for the helpful information. Thank you to everyone, and I hope you have a wonderful afternoon, everyone.